You already know what needs to be done, so why do you keep choosing not to do it? You sit there, fully aware. The task is clear. The next step isn't confusing. You've thought about it enough times to understand exactly what matters. And yet, you don't start. Instead, you adjust something small. You check something quick. You tell yourself you'll begin in a few minutes, when you feel more ready, more focused, more certain. But that moment never really arrives. So the day moves forward, and the thing that actually matters stays untouched, not because you didn't know what to do, but because you didn't step into it when it counted. That's the part most people avoid admitting. Because saying I don't know feels better than saying I didn't act. It protects your identity. It keeps the problem vague. But the truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. You are not lacking clarity. You are resisting execution. And that resistance doesn't show up as fear or laziness. It shows up as hesitation, as small delays, as reasonable distractions that feel justified in the moment. So you stay active, but not effective. You think, but don't move. You prepare, but don't commit. In this video, you're going to see why the gap exists between knowing and doing. Not as a motivation problem, but as a pattern that repeats across your work, your habits, your decisions. And more importantly, what changes when you stop waiting for the right feeling and start treating action as something that doesn't require permission. Because once that shift happens, the distance between where you are and where you want to be stops being confusing and starts being measurable. What you're experiencing is not a lack of discipline, it's a consistent pattern where knowing and doing are separated by a few predictable mechanisms. Once you see them clearly, the confusion disappears. The first is decision fatigue drift. You make clear decisions when your mind is calm, but when it's time to act, your mental energy is lower. So instead of executing, you start reconsidering. What was already decided becomes optional again. The second is comfort prioritization. In the moment of action, your brain doesn't evaluate long-term outcomes, it chooses immediate relief. So even if the task is important, you instinctively lean toward what feels easier right now. Third is the illusion of engagement. You stay busy around the task, researching, organizing, planning, so it feels like progress. But the core action remains untouched. This creates a false sense of movement while keeping you safely away from execution. And finally, there's delayed consequence blindness. The cost of not acting isn't immediate. Nothing breaks instantly. So the urgency feels low. You assume you can afford to delay again and again until the accumulation becomes visible. Take a simple example. Someone wants to build a side income. They watch tutorials, compare strategies, take notes. It feels productive. But they avoid the one uncomfortable step, actually starting and risking failure. So weeks pass with activity, but no output. These patterns are subtle, but they're consistent. And together, they create a system where knowledge exists, but action never follows. Once you recognize this, the problem stops being "why can't I do it?" It becomes, "why do I keep choosing everything except the thing I already decided matters?" The first shift is accepting that knowing creates pressure, and you've learned to escape that pressure instead of acting on it. When you don't know what to do, there's no expectation. You're free to explore, to think, to delay without consequence. But once you know, the situation changes. Now there's a standard. And that standard creates tension, because you're aware that action is required. So instead of moving forward, you unconsciously look for ways to reduce that tension without actually doing the work. You distract yourself. You overthink. You shift focus. Not because you're incapable, but because avoiding the pressure feels easier than resolving it. Consider a workplace scenario. You know you need to have a direct conversation with someone, something clear, necessary, slightly uncomfortable. You've already thought it through. But instead of doing it, you wait. You tell yourself it's not the right time. You refine what you'll say. You delay it to tomorrow. And in doing that, you relieve the immediate pressure at the cost of prolonging the situation. This is the pattern. Knowing creates responsibility, and instead of acting on it, you manage the discomfort around it. The second shift is understanding that action is being treated like a choice, when it should function like a consequence. Right now, you approach tasks as something you decide to do in the moment. Even if you planned them earlier, you reopen the decision when it's time to act. That's where things break. Because the moment you reopen the decision, your current mood gets involved. And mood is unstable. So even strong intentions collapse under temporary resistance. Look at financial discipline. You decide to stop unnecessary spending. It's clear, logical, aligned with your goals. But when you're in the moment, facing a small purchase, you reconsider. It's not a big amount. It won't matter much. You can adjust later. So the decision becomes flexible. There's a line often attributed to Jim Rohn: discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment. That bridge only works if you actually walk across it. If you keep stopping halfway to reconsider, you never reach the other side. Action has to follow the decision, not renegotiate it. The third shift is recognizing how repetition of inaction rewires your baseline. Every time you know what to do and don't do it, something changes. Not dramatically. Quietly. You lower your expectation of yourself. You stop assuming you'll follow through. You begin to expect hesitation, delay, inconsistency. And once that expectation is in place, it becomes self-fulfilling. Take physical health. You know you should train consistently. You understand the benefits. You've seen the results before. But you skip sessions, not out of ignorance, but out of hesitation. At first, it feels like a small break. But over time, your identity shifts. You no longer see yourself as someone who trains, you see yourself as someone who tries to. That difference is subtle, but it changes behavior completely. Because now, inconsistency feels normal. That's the cost of repeated inaction. It doesn't just delay progress, it reshapes how you see yourself. The fourth shift is accepting that the gap between knowing and doing is where most people spend their entire lives. Not because it's complex, but because it's uncomfortable to close. Closing that gap requires removing excuses, removing flexibility, and removing the habit of checking how you feel before you act. It requires a level of directness that most people avoid. There was a situation where someone had been planning a long-term move, changing careers, building something different. They had done the research. They understood the steps. But they stayed in planning mode. Not because they needed more information, but because starting would expose uncertainty. So months passed in preparation. Nothing changed. Until they stopped adding to the plan and executed the first imperfect step. That step wasn't impressive. It wasn't complete. But it broke the pattern. Because it replaced knowing with doing. Across all these areas, work decisions, money habits, physical routines, long-term plans, the pattern stays consistent. You already know enough. The issue is not knowledge, it's the space you've allowed between knowledge and action. And that space is filled with hesitation, negotiation, and temporary comfort. The moment you remove that space, everything changes. Not instantly, but structurally. Because now, knowing leads directly to doing. And once that connection is restored, progress stops depending on how you feel and starts depending on what you've already decided. At this point, the issue should feel less mysterious. You don't have a knowledge gap, you have a follow-through gap. And that gap exists because your decisions don't carry authority once discomfort appears. You've been treating them as flexible, something you can revisit depending on how you feel in the moment. That's the pattern that needs to change. Discipline, in its real form, is not about pushing harder or trying more. It's about removing the option to renegotiate with yourself after a decision has already been made. Because every time you reopen that decision, you weaken it. You introduce doubt. You allow emotion to interfere. You create space for delay. And over time, that space becomes your default. This is where identity becomes the deciding factor. If you see yourself as someone who acts only when it feels right, you will always hesitate. There will always be moments where the feeling isn't there. But if you operate from a standard where action follows decision regardless of mood, then hesitation loses its role. Not because it disappears, but because it stops influencing your behavior. This is where compounding takes over. Each time you act despite resistance, you reduce the internal debate next time. You make execution cleaner. You build a pattern of alignment. And that pattern strengthens quickly. On the other side, every time you delay, you reinforce the habit of stepping back. You make hesitation easier. You lower your own expectations. So over time, the difference between progress and stagnation isn't effort, it's repetition of response. The same moment keeps showing up. You either act on what you already know, or you create another layer of delay. This is why self-respect is directly tied to execution. Not in theory, but in behavior. When your actions consistently match your decisions, you stop questioning yourself. There's no gap to analyze, no confusion to resolve. Just clarity, followed by action. And once that pattern stabilizes, the idea of knowing but not doing stops existing. You already know what happens when you don't act. Nothing collapses immediately. Nothing forces change. Life continues just enough to keep the pattern alive. And that's exactly why it persists. Because the cost is delayed, your mind treats it as optional. But over time, those delays accumulate into something heavier than the original task ever was. Not because the work became harder, but because you kept separating knowing from doing. That separation is the real problem. Not lack of ability. Not lack of clarity. Just repeated permission to pause between decision and action. So the shift is simple, but not easy. It happens in the moment you normally hesitate. Not after thinking more. Not after feeling ready. Not after adjusting the plan. Right there. When the decision already exists, and the only thing left is execution. Because once you remove that gap, even slightly, you stop living in repetition of intention. And you start living in alignment with action. And from that point forward, progress stops being something you plan for. It becomes something you are already doing.